Welcome to another hour of HQ. Jeremy St. Louis alongside Amanda Guerra. It is a Tuesday, and that means it is a travel day for the PGA, heading to Detroit Rock City. But will COVID have something to say about that?
Yeah, it already has. In the first 3 weeks of the tournaments that we saw, we had just 2 players test positive for coronavirus. We have now had 3 in just the past 4 days there. The very latest, that would be golfer to test positive for COVID and withdraw from the Rocket Mortgage Classic. That is Harris English, who, by the way, had a solid 2020 so far with 4 top 20 finishes, including just one 2 weeks ago at RPC Heritage. He is now the 5th golfer overall to test positive, joining the likes of Nick Watney, Cameron Champ, just in the past couple of weeks. Then we saw Denny McCarthy, Dylan Fratelli in the past couple days. So he issued this statement saying, while it is disappointing to receive this news as I feel healthy, I am pleased that the new safety protocols we have in place worked this week. He went on to say, I fully support the tour's new rule allowing anyone on the tournament grounds until testing negative, as protecting others in the field and everyone affiliated with the tournament and the community should be the #1 priority as a result of a positive test. I appreciate the tour's support, and I look forward to competing after I am fully recovered. All right, so let's bring in our golf experts to talk about this. We have Doug Bell, Kyle Porter, Rick Gehman. Doug, I want to start with you. So the good news here, he was not on the charter to the tournament. We assume he was coming from his home in Georgia. But this is the 3rd player to test positive in just a few days. Does that make you nervous, or does it show that their safety protocols are working?
Well, I'm not nervous, and the protocols are working, but what we're going to see now week in and week out are positive tests, because the one gap in the system is that the players take weeks off and they travel back home to different geographic regions in the country, and even some players are now coming into the United States from foreign countries to resume their playing careers in the PGA Tour, and you have caddies that are going home to different parts of the country and coming back. And also, you have teachers. I mean, you're allowed to have one person in your inner circle at the golf course with a credential, and these instructors are coming from all over. So you have gaps in the system, but the protocol is working. But I think this is the new norm on the PGA Tour, and they'll continue to surge ahead and deal with each positive test as it comes.
Yeah, I think with the protocols that are in place for the PGA Tour, I think it's a really good thing. And you saw Harris English mention this, that they're requiring a negative test even to be on the property at an event. And that signifies a couple of things. The first thing is it mitigates the spread of this virus on the property, right? But it also signifies, I think, for the PGA Tour, the seriousness with which they're taking this. And, they started out taking it very seriously. It wasn't the most stringent they could have been about it. It wasn't the most serious they could have took it. So they're kind of ratcheting it up a little bit. And I think that's the right move in this environment. We've seen these different pockets of cities that the numbers are increasing. The numbers are not great. And the PGA Tour has been, I think over the last week, pretty vigilant and pretty diligent about how seriously they're taking everything. And that's going to be the path forward for any league to compete within this COVID-19 environment.
Doug mentioned that positive tests are going to be the new normal. I think that is correct. Commissioner Jay Monahan told us that in his press conference last week, that we're going to have to deal with these positive tests. But I guess in a positive sense, you want to receive those results as early in the week as possible, right? You don't want this coming out Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, especially as play starts for each tournament. And the new protocols for the PGA Tour trying to capture any type of symptoms or any positive tests as early as possible. We know they've invested in these Whoop straps that they've given out to players and caddies and essential personnel to try to check on any symptoms or predict any symptoms of COVID-19. So the new protocols appear to be working, as we can echo Harris English, but we will probably get used to talking about this on a weekly basis.
Kyle, I want you to go into a little bit more of the safety protocols that they're making to keep these players safe. We saw in his statement that he mentioned that you're not even allowed to be on site now until testing negative. I'm not really sure why that hadn't been in place until now, but this is the first week that we're seeing that. I also assume since he tested positive yesterday, that additional testing that they're doing once they get there is being put into place. Are there any additional safety protocols we need to know about that they're putting in place after travelers?
Yeah, there are a couple of things heading into the Rocket Mortgage Classic. But previously, to your point, players had been allowed on site, but not in the clubhouse without a negative test. Now they're not even allowed on site, which is a good thing. The other thing that was interesting, and this came up with Dylan Fratelli, who you mentioned earlier, tested positive for COVID-19. He was one of the guys that was supposed to be on the flight. So the PGA Tour charters a flight from the previous week's city to the next week's city. So from Connecticut to Detroit at the Rocket Mortgage Classic this week. Fratelli was tested, as everybody on that flight was, before that flight. Now players are going to start being tested after that flight as well. So heading into the next week. The PGA Tour is also bringing back the fitness trailer for players to work out in on site at these events. That keeps them from going out, going to different gyms. Just keeps them from kind of spreading out, honestly, during the week and not knowing maybe where they're at. And then the last one is that coaches and trainers, kind of these personnel that are within what the PGA Tour is calling their bubble, they're going to have to be tested too. Previously, it was players and caddies and coaches as well. Now the trainers that are there are also going to have to be tested. So you see some of the protocols that I'm talking about there. And again, this is the PGA Tour taking this very seriously, ratcheting things up, and that's a good thing for them going forward.
All right, let's get to the fun part of this. Let's talk about actual golf. We're going to see the return of Webb Simpson. He had a lot of momentum coming off that win at RBC Heritage. He did have to withdraw from Travelers because his caddy tested positive, so he is back. Rick Gehman, what do you think we can expect from him?
I think we expect more of what we've seen from Webb Simpson over the last year or two. He's elevated himself literally into a top 5 player in the world, although Dustin Johnson just kicked him out of the top 5 after 1 week of being inside of it. But Webb is perpetually underrated. He's one of the best players on the face of the earth, especially when everyone walks off the tee box. You know, his driving game, while accurate, is not very long. But once you start everybody in the fairway, there are few golfers who can compare with Webb Simpson's game. So Detroit Golf Club, maybe not necessarily the best fit for Webb Simpson, but I certainly expect his name to be near the top of the leaderboard.
After his win at the RBC Heritage, he was anxious to play at the Travelers. See, these players know they have about a 6-week window where they play at a high level, and they know they can easily run out, and they want to stick with that horse. They want to keep riding that pony. So he was anxious, but unfortunately, players and caddies tested positive that he and his caddy, Paul Tesori, were close to on the driving range and the putting greens, so they went home last week just as a precaution. Webb has 5 small children, so he did the prudent thing, and Paul Tesori has a little boy, and they just wanted to go home and get checked, but now they want to be back because they want to keep riding that momentum. And keep in mind now, Webb Simpson is #1 in FedEx Cup points. He's #1 in scoring average. He's #1 in birdies per round. So he is riding high right now. And if you had to vote for PGA Tour Player of the Year right now, he would be the leading candidate. So let's see what happens. Let's see if that pony is still running at full speed this week in Detroit. I suspect it will be.
What Doug means is that Webb would be the leading candidate other than Brendan Todd, who's going to be the PGA Tour Player of the Year later on this year. Now, Webb's a top 3 guy in the world right now, and it might sound weird to say, especially because he missed the cut at the Charles Schwab Challenge. You don't think of him as being a top 3 guy, but you look at some of the numbers. This year, he's got a couple wins. Over the last 2 years, he's only missed 2 cuts, which is just an insane stat that I still can't get over. And you look at him and Bryson DeChambeau, who are both in this field. I have them in my top 3 right now. You could argue that. You could throw Rory in there. You could throw a JT in there. But based on how guys are playing right now, I think Webb Simpson's one of the 2 or 3 best players in the world. So it'll be fun to see him again in Detroit.
All right. As we mentioned yesterday, it is not the absolutely loaded, stacked field we've seen the past 3 weeks. We were very excited to see those. But it is still very good. We not only get Webb Simpson, Kyle, according to you, the best player in the world right now, Bryson DeChambeau. I remember you said that yesterday. Give me each of you. We'll start with you, Kyle. I'm not sure if it's Bryson or somebody else, a golfer to watch in this tournament.
Yeah, you know, I'd like to go a little bit deeper. I mean, I love the Bryson storyline. It's fascinating, right? It's compelling, it's fun, it's memeable, it's everything that you want it to be. But I do like in these events, we saw last year Nate Lashley wins this tournament. Doc Redman gets an exemption, gets onto the PGA Tour via this tournament by finishing tied for 2nd. And this year, I like to go deep with somebody like a Will Gordon, who last week he plays great at the Travelers Championship. He earned a special temporary membership based on his performance last week, in which he finishes tied for third. He's the 2019 SEC Player of the Year. He's a Ben Hogan Award semifinalist back in 2019. He's certainly not a household name, but he's somebody that I think is going to be really good on the PGA Tour for a long time. And like Doug mentioned with Webb, I think you get guys who maybe they can ride a little bit of a heater. We saw this with Victor Hovland. We saw it with Colin Morikawa. These guys who in the summer, they're right out of college. They're wanting to play a ton of golf. They have the energy for it. Will Gordon has an opportunity right now to ride a little bit of a heater here, earn full status on the PGA Tour for the next 2 or 3 seasons. I think he's going to have a really good week in Detroit this week.
Yeah, I do like the deep-end fields. We get to talk about guys that are outside the top 50, top 100 in the world. And my player to watch is Doc Redman. Kyle alluded to this. He finished second here last year. It's still his best finish as a professional. But I'm looking at what he's been doing this year since the restart. And strokes gained tee to green is one of the most important and telling stats on the PGA Tour. 2 weeks ago, Redman was 13th in strokes gained tee to green at the RBC Heritage. He was third last week. He's gained 16 strokes from tee to green in just his last 7 rounds. To put that into perspective, Bryson DeChambeau's only gained 10. He's almost lapping the field with Bryson. So Doc Redman is a guy who is hitting the ball super well right now at a place that he's had success. He's my player to watch.
I'm going to be watching Ricky Fowler because he's going through the worst slump of his career. Now, playing in Detroit because Rocket Mortgage is one of his big sponsors. We've seen those commercials, and they're terrific. And wouldn't it be great for Ricky to win the tournament where his big sponsor is putting their name to it? But that could be a tall order. Now, he's 31 years old. He's fallen out of the top 30 in the world for the first time in 5 years. He's 31st. And when you look at his statistics, guys, driving distance just over 292 yards. That's 150th on the PGA Tour. He's basically giving up 30 yards to the top guys like Bryson DeChambeau and others. And his greens in regulation, they've gone way, way down. He's 120th greens hit in regulation. So his distance is going down. His accuracy is going down. He's missed a couple of cuts. His last win was the Waste Management Phoenix Open back at the beginning of 2019. So he's working his way through what is the worst slump of his career. Still the ever popular Ricky Fowler. People love him, and for good reason, because he's a terrific young man. But he's got to get his game back on track. And perhaps this week in Detroit, he'll have that opportunity, of course, that is a little easier than what they played up to this point, 4 par 5s. And we'll see if Ricky can go 4 rounds in the 60s. Will be a great comeback week for Ricky Fowler.
It is Rocket Mortgage. It's 4th of July, so maybe Ricky can find some fireworks. That is your dad joke for the day. All right, guys, it was really bad. Thanks so much. Hang on, we're not done with you.
Still to come on HQ, where can you make some money this weekend when it comes to the Rocket Mortgage Classic? Guys will tell you next. The Rocket Mortgage Classic at Detroit Golf Club is the 4th event on the PGA Tour since the restart. Here are the odds for this week's event. Bryson DeChambeau had dropped to 6-1. Now it's at 6.5. And then you see Webb Simpson at 12-1. He, of course, won the RBC Heritage, took off last week. Tyrrell Hatton is also in there at 16-1, along with Patrick Reed, who tied for 5th at this event last year. Hideki Matsuyama tied for 13th last year. Sungjae Im, Victor Hovland also in there among names to perhaps put some money on. For more on that, let's welcome back Kyle Porter, Rick Gehman, and Doug Bell to talk about some guys you might be willing to throw some cash towards. Stars and Scrubs Week, I think, is how you referred to it on the podcast, Rick Gehman. So, Kyle, let's start with you. Who is your sleeper going into the Rocket Mortgage Classic?
Well, my sleeper is somebody that I've already talked about today, and that's Will Gordon. The last time I saw him, I think he's 80-1, 75-1, something like that. You know, he's not a big name. I don't know if he ever will be. I think he could be. I think he's got a ton of potential. I love pedigrees. He's got a great pedigree. Was a great player at Vanderbilt. Again, SEC Player of the Year. He was a Ben Hogan Award semifinalist along with guys like Colin Morikawa, Victor Hovland, Matthew Wolff. I mean, big-time names. And he was right there with him, and he played great last week. You know, I was really impressed. He shoots 71 next to Phil on Saturday, bounces back on Sunday with a 64, with a lot on the line for him, with this temporary exemption on the line. So I thought that was a big-time performance. I'm riding the hot hand a little bit and getting him at what I think is a pretty good number for a player that I believe will end up being pretty good on the PGA Tour for quite a long time.
I'm looking at Harold Varner III at 66-1 as my sleeper. Looking back to last week's Travelers Championship, Varner gained over 7 strokes on approach. It's an outrageous number. It was 5th best in the field, and that usually bodes well for the following week. But what I think is even more interesting about Harold Varner III is he tries to get his first PGA Tour victory is kind of this scar tissue that he's built up over the past year or year and a half. We remember him in the final group at last year's PGA Championship with Brooks Koepka before shooting an 81 and falling outside the top 40. We remember him at Genesis just in mid-February this year, touching the lead, getting to the iconic 10th hole at Riviera and cold topping his tee shot there. And then just recently played well at Colonial the first week back. Again, fades on the weekend. That is all this scar tissue that a lot of golfers need to build up before finally breaking through for that first victory. And Varner is trending in the right direction. He's building up that scar tissue, and he's very interesting at 66-1.
And I'm in agreement with Kyle on Will Gordon, this young man from Vanderbilt, 23 years old. I walked with him last week for PGA Tour Radio on Saturday when he put a lot of pressure on himself and shot 71, 1 over, playing with Phil Mickelson. And I saw a golfer with a lot of emotion. I mean, he was stomping around, throwing his club after some bad shots, and I like that. And said afterwards, I was flat out pressing too much. And then on Sunday with John Rahm, goes out and shoots 64 and ties for 3rd. And keep in mind, he tied for 10th at the RSM Classic. People forget or maybe don't even realize. And he was tied for 21st at the Farmers Insurance Open at Torrey Pines. This guy, he didn't come out with a fanfare of the Morikawas and Victor Hovland and Matthew Wolff. He went to Canada, the McKenzie Tour, and kind of earned his spurs there. But I'm telling you, the eyeball test, he can flat out golf his ball. I really like the kid. He's got a little moxie to him. And I love this story that he told me, you know, back when he was 11, 12 years old, and Davidson was making that run to the Elite Eight. Steph Curry and his teammates, they stayed at his family's house. They were the host family, and he and Steph would go out and shoot baskets in the driveway. And so they've become good friends over the years. And Steph, through Phil Mickelson last week, he said, be sure and tell him that I'm following him, I'm watching him. And so it's really a cool relationship. Will Gordon, nobody's heard of this guy, but I think after what I saw last week, it wouldn't shock me in the least if he comes out and wins this week. I mean, he's that good. And those odds, oh my gosh, I love those odds.
Pressure either crushes you or makes diamonds, and in Will Gordon's case, he seems to be responding to it very well. Okay, looking at the top 10 on the PGA Tour, there are some pretty good names that are there, some pretty good names that are playing this week, some that aren't. Let's get your top 10 lock. Rick, I'll start with you on this one. Who is your top 10 lock for the Rocket Mortgage Classic?
Sure. I usually like to go a little bit deeper, but we're throwing that all out the window. It is certainly stars and scrubs, and I'm going to take a star. I'm going to take Bryson DeChambeau if you're looking for a lock. Now, 6 straight top 10s. If you've been paying even the smallest bit of attention since the tour's restart, you realize that what Bryson DeChambeau is doing right now is incredibly special. He's 46 under par. It's the best total aggregate number of anyone since this restart. And here's one that really hammers it home for me. This off the tee game that he's worked so hard on. Last week at the Travelers, he was 13th in the field in strokes gained off the tee, but that number was his worst number of the calendar year. So even when he doesn't have his good stuff, he's one of the best players in the field. Give me Bryson as my top 10 lock.
My top 10 lock is Patrick Reed, who finished tied for 5th here last year in the inaugural event in Detroit. And this golf course matches up in characteristics with Colonial, where Patrick finished tied for 7th. It's bent grass greens, and Patrick Reed loves that putting surface. and he's really one of the better putters with that stroke. It's incredible. Wide fairways at Detroit Golf Club, and Patrick doesn't hit a lot of fairways compared to some of the top players, and I think this gives him flexibility, if you will, to really go out and show his stuff. You know, on his golf bag, his sponsor is Grind Matters, and that's the people who make his shafts, by the way, and he's one of the best grinders on tour. When I asked him about that, I said, hey, isn't it kind of appropriate that Grind Matters is your sponsor? And he laughed. He said, yeah, he really appreciates the fact. In other words, he doesn't mail it in. I mean, he works hard out there, and I think Patrick Reed is an absolute top 10 lock this week in Detroit.
I've got Victor Hovland. Rick was making me wishing that I picked Bryson. He kind of talked me into that there, but I've got Victor Hovland. He's had a really good run over the last 3 weeks, 3 top 25s in a row since the restart. And, you know, I always go back to strokes gained off the tee, strokes gained on approach shots. And if you look at the top 5, if you add those numbers together, who's the best driver, who's the best iron player, you've got names like Rory, you've got Paul Casey up there, and you've got Victor Hovland in there. He's been, in terms of this season, a top 5 guy off the tee and with his irons. And at some point that pays off, right? At some point that pays off with a top 10, especially in a lesser field like this. You know, last week he finishes T11. Last week's an elite field. And so I think that translates just with the way he's playing. He's tightened up the short game just a little bit, statistically anyway. I think he's gonna contend to win and end up somewhere in the top 10 in Detroit.
Kyle, to your point, you go from an elite field to one that's pretty wide open, so I'm very curious to see who you guys are picking as a winner here. Rick, give me your pick as a winner for the Rocket Mortgage Classic.
Certainly. Well, Kyle, if it makes you feel any better, I'll take your top 10 lock and I'll make him my winner. It's Victor Hovland, 22-1. And Kyle nailed it. The statistical profile is great, but when he won the Puerto Rico Open earlier this year, he told us his short game needs some work. He used a little bit more colorful way to describe it, but he told us that his short game is not so great, and he was right. 9 straight events before the lockdown, before the shutdown, he lost strokes around the green. Since the restart, he's actually gained in that category in 2 of his 3 starts. So my thinking is the rest of his game is already spectacular. If he has plugged the one hole, the one thing that has been kind of holding him back even just a little bit, this guy's already a tour winner. If he plugged that, then he is certainly going to be in line for a lot of wins in his future, and I think it could start this week at the Rocket Mortgage.
I'm going with the guy who's the odds-on favorite to win this week, Bryson DeChambeau, guys. This is a golf course, par 72. There's 4 par 5s, and the Kraken will be out a lot. You know, it was interesting. Cameron Champ did not play last week because he tested positive, and now he's slightly gone ahead of Bryson DeChambeau for driving distance on the PGA Tour, and you know Bryson wants to get that back. And this is an interesting story. Last week at the Travelers, during the rain delay, the players were allowed to go out and get warmed up before they went back out. Bryson DeChambeau had already hit his driver at 18, so he knew where his ball was in the left-hand rough. And most players prepare when they come back like that, hitting the shot that they expect to play. And for Bryson, that probably was some sort of wedge. But he used that 15 minutes to go out and work out the kinks in his driver, even though the driver was done for the tournament, for the day. I mean, he went out there, DJ was going through his bag, and all these guys are doing their thing, and he's hitting driver after driver. He's going to flex his muscles this week. He's had an incredible run. He's led the tour in headlines for the restart, for his weight gain, for his protein shakes, for his towering tee shots, and now he wants to make headlines with a W. I mean, he told me that. He said, listen, I'm tired of all the talk about all this other stuff. I want to talk about a win. And I think it comes at a golf course that he should absolutely dominate, a golf course that he absolutely should eat up with rounds in the mid to low 60s every single day. I'll take Bryson DeChambeau.
Doug, that is the least surprising story I have heard in the last 2 months, is that Bryson was hitting driver, even though he wasn't going to hit driver the rest of the week. We are actually all picking each other's lock for top 10, because I've got Patrick Reed winning the Rocket Mortgage Classic this week. Like Doug mentioned earlier, he finished in the top 5 or the top 10 here last year. He's been a little up and down since the restart. He had a top 10 at Colonial a couple weeks ago. Missed the cut when I picked him at RBC Heritage, and then he was all right last week at the Travelers Championship. But again, this is a lesser field. Patrick Reed is a really, really good player. He's in the top 10 in the world. He stands out with the Brysons, with the Webb Simpsons as one of the extreme favorites, and yet his number, the number you can get him at, I think it's 16-1, 18-1. You see it right there, 18-1. That's a good number for him because, again, he's one of the 3 or 4 best guys in the field, but you're not getting him at one of the 3 or 4 best guys in the field type number. So love him this week. Look for him to get another win following up Mexico earlier this year.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. They are Kyle Porter, Rick Gehman, and Doug Bell, 3 of the best golf gurus in the business, bringing it as always. And, of course, for more insight, analysis, and betting advice for this tournament and every tournament, check out the First Cut podcast. Tuesday's pod is all about setting those DFS lineups. Rick and Greg Ducharme with some great insight into how to build your lineup in a Stars and Scrubs week. Download and subscribe wherever you get your preferred audio.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.